Welcome to this course. We're looking at the System Security Certified Practitioners, the SSCP certification by ISC Squared. Here we're looking at the Official Study Guide, 2nd edition, ISB number 9781119542940. I wanted to first point out that these PowerPoint slides are owned and copyrighted by Wiley Text, as it is part of this textbook. These videos are just a run through of core concepts throughout this text. Thank you. So what is information security? Our book is not always providing the most clear or accurate definition. So the book says we start with something that everyone knows. I'm going to use the example of a mom and pop computer repair shop. So essentially, they're open Monday through Saturday. You can bring your devices in and they will repair your computer and they'll return it to you. The problem is we have to have a few things in place in order for that to happen. First, we have to be able to formalize what are the repairs, what's our scope of work, what are our common prices. What do we do if we find something illegal while doing a repair? What happens if we are doing a computer upgrade and we accidentally destroy the hard drive? So we actually have to have a structure that is defining kind of our functionality, our scope, our purpose, our guidelines, our rules. And from there, we can start turning them into useful information. Procedural. Essentially, how do we take our overall structure and make it so that we're implementing those things day to day? So, price was one of the ones that I brought up with the formalized structure. We have a formalized project price. If we're doing a computer upgrade, we expect it to take X amount of time. We expect it to be X amount of price. We can implement that procedurally into day-to-day operations. If we are looking at hardware repair or looking at data recovery, we can actually define the structure, take in that defined structure and implement processes that help us work through them at a day-to-day process or day-to-day tasks. What we can do is we can verify this information, we can test it, we can verify it, and we can adjust it as necessary. If we say that we do an hourly repair of $50, but we have a PC upgrade project price of $500, but we only expect it to take 3 hours. Well, 3 hours should be $150. The project price is $500. There is some discrepancy there. That would be one of the things that we could verify and then adjust as necessary. Information security protections are the same way. If we're trying to protect X resource, we define what that resource is, we define the structure we're going to use to protect that resource, we ensure that we're able to protect it on a regular basis. Now remember, security is not just about securing it. Security is about securing a resource and keeping the availability of that resource at a specific level. A resource only is helpful if it's secure and accessible or available. So securing it by locking it in a vault doesn't help. And again, it doesn't matter what the resource is. We can always test the controls. Something that our book has not done a very good job at is defining our different ways of setting up our security controls. Typically, they're done 3 ways: administrative, technical or logical, and physical. Our administrative controls are our policies, our procedures, our guidelines. Our technical or logical controls are going to be just that. Those are the technical controls. And we can have physical controls if necessary. Everything should be tied back to administrative controls. That's what's defining our scope. Those policies define how we set up our technical or physical procedures. For example, maybe we want to have a password policy. What we would do is we would have an administrative policy written up that defines the scope of our password policy. How often we change it, what type of passwords are allowed, the scope. Are we talking 3 of 4 character types, uppercase, lowercase, number of special characters, or are we talking 4 of the 4? Our administrative policy would dictate that structure. From there, our technical control would implement the appropriate technology that would be used to meet the administrative policy. Everything is tied back to the administrative policy, or at least it should be. Some organizations often lack the administrative policy before they do the technical policy. And the problem with that is we do not have a scope for those policies, so they have an often time to get bloated. So in our previous lecture, we talked about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. But we also have this new thing called privacy. We have an inherent right to certain levels of privacy. If we send an email from a work email, privacy to a degree is expected. However, the corporation, the company that owns the email, has the right to view that content. So the expected right to privacy for the individual sending the email is they will see it, the company will see it, and the recipient would see it. That is the expected level of privacy. If you're using Gmail, for example, the right to privacy is you, the person sending it, the recipient, and maybe a Google service that is verifying integrity of communication sent. What I mean by that literally is if you say something that might be illegal, it might flag something in the email system that would then allow the email system to review the contents of your email. But I mean, for the most part, it should be the sender and receiver and only those two individuals. Another hard portion of our lecture, the chapter reading for our lecture, was safety and security. Essentially, safety means causes no harm. That means if it's working correctly, there should be no harm. When it fails, when it stops, when it degrades, there should be no harm. For example, if we are talking about a fire alarm suppression door, if the fire alarm goes off, those doors should automatically be unlocked to allow for egress. However, if there is an issue with the door, it may prevent egress that would cause a safety concern. While in contrast, security is typically kept from harm using confidentiality and integrity. So let's go ahead and return back to privacy. Talk about private spaces and places. You have to understand what would be the inherent private place. Your home, for example, if your windows are open, it may not be classified as a private space or place. What is the expectation of privacy when there are windows that are open? That's a big thing. Understanding that private information is typically information that is to be kept private, and that is different from privileged information. Privileged information is something that can be shared with the appropriate privileges. The core concept here is what is classified as reasonable expectation of privacy, the reasonable efforts to control that information. For example, if you are in your living room having an argument with the curtains closed, is there an expectation of privacy there? Yes, curtains are closed. If the curtains are wide open and the windows are open, there is no expected right to privacy because those areas are open and it's publicly viewable. You can view it from the curb. If you are in a public park talking. There is no expected right to privacy there. You're in a public place. One of the last things our chapter does bring up is our data breach incidences. Basically, data breaches typically occur because a failure in controls. The controls that are put into place are not the correct controls or may not have been verified controls, and there's a failure to control access. So, individuals, threat actors, have been able to gain access, and then data breach may occur. Basically, when we are talking a data breach, that means the privacy has been compromised. The confidentiality has been compromised. That means an individual's or organization has lost that privilege of that privacy. When we're talking sales data, that could be the consumer privacy, and it could be also the organizational privacy to keep those records private. There is a little comparison between privacy and security. The issue is they're not binary choices. It's not one or the other. You can actually have privacy and security. It's about having a nice balance between the two. And oftentimes this is confused transparency with accountability within security. We can verify that controls are in place to protect a resource without understanding what the controls are. Essentially, we can audit, are there controls in place? Yes, no. Are those controls sufficient to protect that resource? Yes, no. Is there accountability? If someone tries to access that resource, is that readable somewhere? Yes, no. We may not know the in-depth requirements or the in-depth view of those controls, but we can actually verify that they are there. With everything else that is going on, we have a growing security culture. Essentially, we are being raised to understand that what our actions are doing have an implication. So the awareness of our security is definitely increasing. Security hygiene is definitely growing as data breaches have occurred and individuals have definitely become affected. Realistically, we oftentimes would ignore things unless they personally affected ourselves. But with all of the data breaches lately, that effect of the individual has been increasing, has been growing. So that has helped the individual's, Americans' attitude to be more security conscious. Now, are we where we need to be? No, not yet. But at least people are starting to talk about basic security. Focus is with the orientation and the training of users, understanding that maybe not everything should have a simple password. Maybe not we not use the exact same password for everything. That is an ongoing training, and part of that is going to be just continuing education. This means we have to grow everyone, not just within the organization, but across the board. The markets, our partnerships, our relationships, our consumers, our customers, everyone across the board needs to be responsible for protection, for security. A company cannot guard against a customer's account being compromised if the customer used a basic password. That is why the customer needs to be held accountable, just like the organization has to be held accountable. It's a growing concern that is being developed. There has to be a certain level of ethics as professional security individuals. Professionals basically will hold a life or death power in society, and that's subjective. Certain professionals hold that type of power, not everyone. Which that means we have to hold those professionals to the highest standard. If we trust the cable company to come into our house, there has to be a set level of ethical or moral structure that they have not to distill from us while we're not watching them. There has to be a base level of ethical standards for that company to employ those individuals. Basically, all of this goes back to being able to practice their professionalism, the organization, in their hiring practices, because what the individual does represents the company. And within today's society, we've seen individuals get terminated from jobs for issues they've done off the clock that may actually reflect on the overall organization. So, having the expectation of an ethical standard has become very commonplace. Like any professional group, ISC Squared does have their own code of ethics. So when you actually do look at becoming an SSCP, you actually will commit to adhering to the code of ethics set forth by ISC Squared. Violations of this basically means that you could lose your certification if you're in violation of that certification. If you violate the terms of that ethical behavior that ISC Squared sets forth, you could lose your certification. And I have known individuals that have done things that have resulted in a removal of their certification and their banning of their certification. Essentially, the preamble for our ethical behavior standards are safety and welfare of the society for the common good, duty to principles and to each other. This requires that we adhere to and be seen to adhere to the highest levels of ethical standards. And our basic canons are protect society, common good, necessary public trust and confidence, and the infrastructure. Essentially, to act honorably, honestly, justly, responsible, and legally. Provide diligence, competence, service to our principles, and to advance and protect the profession of system security certified practitioners and information security practitioners. That is it for the brief overview for this chapter. If you have any questions, please reach out. So I have taken and modified some additional slides from the textbook. These slides from this slide forward are not part of the official slide deck, but these are important topics that were in the chapter that just did not make the cut for the PowerPoint for whatever reason. So when we're talking about IT risk management, one of the big things we have to discuss is defense. And defense is a set of strategies to meet the goal of the organization. Management is about making decisions on what types of defense controls to put into place and what to protect. Mitigation is the set of tactics that will be chosen to implement for those decisions. So management actually has to decide what controls to put into place for defense. What are the mitigating tactics to secure those controls? That's part of what this section is focused on. Another one is about understanding the integrated information risk management. Essentially, what is risk management? It is the ability to protect what is important to the organization. The purpose of this is to understand the why. The mitigation focuses on the how. Understand that some outcomes, processes, or assets are by their nature more critical to the organization's success than others, meaning for those more critical outcomes, processes, and assets, they should be assigned a higher risk value. If, for example, phones are a high priority and it has the same level of access as, let's say, the website. If the website's not critical and phones are, we need to be able to prioritize accordingly. By the same token, some threats pose more danger to the organization and its vulnerabilities than others do. So we have to keep in mind that Some threats are larger targets, are larger risks to the organization than some common ones. So, for example, if we're looking at phishing attacks and ransomware, we can rank them based off of how we've defined the possible outcomes. And what I mean by that is, if we're looking at we are targeted daily by phishing attacks, and we know that those phishing attacks bring in ransomware. However, we don't allow emails from outside the organization. That helps mitigate several of those factors. So ransomware may be mitigated in that regard. However, that's not a realistic scenario because allowing no email from outside kind of would defeat the purpose of that. So we're actually going to be talking about some of these terms in a few slides, but this is what was brought up in the chapter about risk mitigation. So defense strategies. Well, one of the first ones is a NIST standard, the NIST 837. This brings up the risk management framework, and the framework is actually the general framework that is used. Understand that these frameworks are allowing leadership and management to have a basic understanding of the risk process. This sets them a starting point. One common concept that is seen throughout this chapter is this concept of defense in depth. Not having just one control, but layering defense so that if one layer is breached, there are other layers there to take their place. One must also understand, though, it's a dangerous world. So essentially, when we talk risk management, it is simple. This is all about being able to make decisions in a reliable manner. And sometimes that means using controls to help aid the decision-making process. Each of the elements for a basic decision is, again, that reliability. Each section of that reliable choice has its own elements of the CIA triad that we've discussed before. So we have to understand risk. So what is risk? Risk is the possibility that an event can occur that can disrupt or damage the organization. Normally, risk involves a threat, and that could be an actor or a force of nature. And this will be acting on an asset's vulnerabilities to cause the undesirable results. So that means, what's a threat? What's vulnerability? It's not enough just to say risk. We have to understand how threats and vulnerabilities play into that. A threat is a potential negative action or event facilitated by a vulnerability that results in an unwanted impact to the organization. Vulnerability is just a weakness, and if we're looking at the equation for measuring risk, risk is equal to threat times the vulnerability. When we're looking at risk, there are four main faces of risk. And again, risk is about possible occurrence, not necessarily the occurrence by itself. There are three main rules when we're looking at risk. Rule 1, all things will end, meaning systems will fail, parts will wear out, people get sick, it just happens. Rule 2, the best you can do in the face of Rule 1 is spend money, time, and effort making something more robust and resilient at the expense of others. Thus, trade-off of risk of one kind of failure for another. Rule 3, there's nothing you can do to avoid Rule 1 and Rule 2. Things will end, and the sad part is, normally money, time, and effort / energy are required to deal with it. So what are these four faces of risk? In reality, that just is a clever way of saying types of risk. There are four main types of risk: outcome-based, process-based, asset-based, and threat-based or vulnerability-based. So in reality, there's 5 here. It's just our book loves to combine that last one for whatever reason. Outcome based basically is risk that looks at why people or the organization do what they do. The outcomes of achieving those goals or objectives are tangible or intangible, but we can reproduce and harvest the what we put into it. So outcome there is achieving specific goals or objectives, where process based basically is defining that we want something, we want to achieve something. All of that requires us to take some form of action. That action requires us to make a decision. Even if there's only one action that will flow from the decision, that's the process. In an organizational term, a business process takes a logical sequence of purpose, intention, conditions, and constraints and structures them in a set of actions. Essentially, process-based risk is understanding that there's a sequence to this process. Third is asset. Regardless of how we want to define asset, everything is going to have a risk. Broadly speaking, assets are organization or individual, anything that we're going to be doing to meet or achieve our goals and objectives. That includes things like building, machinery, money, anything tangible. If we're dealing with people, that means knowledge, understanding the business flow, business logic, business process, intellectual property. Those are all intangible assets, but all of them have value to the organization, and all of them have a inherent risk to them. Fourth is threat-based or vulnerability-based. Threat actors, either nature or human, are the things that can cause damage or destruction leading to loss. Vulnerabilities, as we defined earlier, are weaknesses within the system, process, assets, so forth. So, when they fell, not if they fell, but when they fell, they result in damage, disruption, and loss. Typically, threats or threat actors will exploit vulnerabilities. So these threats can be nature, such as a storm or earthquake, could be accidental or other. Sometimes threat-based cannot be avoided. Sometimes it's unintentional, it happens. It could be Mother Nature. Those are the 4 main types of risk that this chapter outlines. We have a few control elements. Typical control elements are administrative, technical, and logical, or physical. I know we've discussed these before, but these are equally important, so we're going to discuss them probably several more times throughout the PowerPoints that are coming up. Administrative are more policy in nature. Technical and logical are more of the technical constraints. Physical controls are going to be, again, just controls that are physical in nature. Everything ties back to administrative controls. The administrative controls outline everything. They outline the scope. The technical and physical controls basically are implemented based off of the scope of the administrative controls. There's a few risk terms that we really need to understand. One of the main concepts is trust but verify. Don't just take people's word for it. Don't just take the system's word that it happens. Password policy. Maybe you set a password policy in Active Directory. You want to make sure that this is functioning. You verify its functioning by creating the circumstances that would cause the policy to invoke or to fail, thus ensuring that the policy is doing what is expected. The next is this due care versus due diligence. Due care is using reasonable care to protect the interests of the organization. Due diligence is practicing the activities that maintain the due care effort. Another thing for risk is this be prepared. We should always start with a current set of priorities for our goals and objectives for the organization. And then from there, you define the overall structure used to protect your priorities of the organization. Since we've talked about the NIST Risk Management Framework 800-37, here are the main 7 phases: prepared, categorize, select, implement, access, authorize, monitor. We're not diving too deep in the phases. It was just wanting to point out that there is a structure to the risk management framework. Though this is only one of the frameworks that are out there. ISO has a standard for 31,000. There's also a plan, do, check, PDCA framework as well. There's not a single framework that was always going to fit. So additional frameworks for specific circumstances. So you have to use the correct framework. The risk management framework is just a common framework. It is not the end-all, be-all type framework. Risk management has 2 main components: the risk assessment and risk tolerance. The assessment will be assessing risk and looking at the likelihood of occurrence, though how we perform the assessment is based off of what we are assessing. Risk tolerance, in contrast, is the degree that we're willing to tolerate certain events. So within assessment, we have 2 main types: quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative is essentially risk by numbers. And we can do calculations like single loss expectancy, annual rate of occurrence, annual loss of expectancy. These are all equations that we can use to help identify quantitative risk. While in contrast, qualitative risk assessments focus on inherent quality aspects or characteristics of the risk as it relates to the outcomes of risk occurrence. Loss of business could be losing a few customers, losing many customers, or closing the entire business. These are intangible. These are loss of reputation is also there. These are intangible assets that are not as easy to quantify. We have a very few additional terms that we really need to discuss. Common vulnerabilities and exposure, CVEs. Basically, as vulnerabilities are found, we get CVE numbers. Basically, there are databases out there that have common vulnerabilities and exposures as they're identified, so that you can make sure that you're current on what vulnerabilities have been found. So how do you create priorities? We keep saying priorities, but what does that mean? Well, an organization will have a structure to their processes and to their business. What is critical for their business? What ends up happening is the businesses will run a business impact analysis, BIA. This will outline what systems, what platforms, what technology, what departments, what processes are the most crucial for the business to run. This allows the organization to develop the priorities. That way they know what is the most critical system. Again, earlier I used the phone versus the website example. If you're a call center and your phones bring in your income and your website is just more for informational, well, the higher priority would be on the phone system. So if there's an outage, you know what system you must bring up online first, the one that's going to make the biggest impact on the organization. So one thing that this chapter brought up is policies versus procedure. They talked about this for maybe 3 or 4 sentences only. Policies are the guidelines. Procedures are the actions that are taken to ensure that policies are met. So lastly, we need to talk about risk action. This chapter talks about 4 main types of risk action. However, in general, these are not the only types of risk actions that are out there. We also have things like ignore and accept risk, instead of just the 4 that our book outlines. So our book predominantly focuses on the 4. Deter, detect, prevent, avoid. Deter means to discourage or dissuade someone to not do something. Detect means to notice or consciously observe an element of interest that is happening. 3. Prevent. Basically, you prevent or stop an attack from happening. 4. You avoid the action altogether. Well, you could also mitigate risk. You can also ignore the risk, or you can accept the risk. They all play very specific roles. For example, how do you mitigate the risk of driving a car and not having to worry about an accident? Well, you mitigate the risk of an accident by having insurance. You can accept the risk of driving a car, knowing that certain things may happen, by just consciously deciding that you're going to accept this risk and move forward. You can deter the risk of getting into a car accident by maybe driving at off-peak hours, or maybe having a much larger vehicle. You can avoid the risk of getting into a car accident by, well, not getting into a car accident. You could prevent it by not leaving your house. So again, these are just generic examples of how we could look at those different actions, risk actions. Again, this is not a complete list. This is just what is brought up in our text. So that is actually all of the additional high points for this lecture that I thought were important. If you have any questions or concerns, please reach out. Thank you. If you have any questions or concerns, please reach out. Thank you.